Now, this is an opportunity for me to share the research that I enjoy doing so much, and really to do something that I consider a service, to try to help people be less afraid of the unknowns. And fear of death is really such a struggle in the world these days. And it's unnecessary. So let's talk about that. It's a wonderful spring day outside, a very appropriate time to talk about death, actually, because new life, new birth, death is nature's way of clearing away old, outworn forms so that new forms can be created and serve the ever-growing consciousness that needs new forms. I want to say before I start, this talk will go online as well as today, and people are interested in death oftentimes because they are facing it themselves, or they're grieving the loss of someone. And I want to say that I respect that difficulty and the suffering that's involved. It's not easy to let go of somebody, and it's well, in a way, it unites us. This is one thing that all human beings face, whether it's their own death or the death of a loved one. In that, we at least have an excuse to develop compassion for each other. It's one common ground for all of us. My mother died quite a while ago now, over 30 years ago. And I remember at the time having a dream or two afterwards where she would be at the dinner table with the rest of us. And I'd think, well, you're here after all. And it was quite reassuring. And it's surprising how many people have that experience. Before she died, I wanted to help her. Even back then, 30 years ago, I'd been studying Alice Bailey and I had all kinds of information. And I wasn't sure what the best way to help her was. So I talked to the local holy man where I lived. I lived in Santa Cruz at the time. And up in the mountains, Mount Madonna, was a beautiful soul named Hari Das. And he died some years ago now. But you could ask him questions, and he had very interesting answers. I asked him, how can I help my mother? And he said that the people who are dying are very busy. They have their internal processes they're working on. They're usually not interested in this information. And it often doesn't even serve to try to bring it up. It complicates things for them. I thought that was interesting advice. And another question I asked him is loosely related to death. I asked him, is it okay to kill mosquitoes? And the response I thought was particularly good. He said that the blood is the life, and human life is more precious than mosquito life. So I've interpreted that as death to all mosquitoes since then. So let me read a quote about death here from Leadbeater. It is impossible for us to calculate the vast amount of utterly unnecessary sorrow and terror and misery which mankind in the aggregate has suffered simply from its ignorance and superstition with regard to this one most important matter. So this emphasis was laid from the beginning of the Theosophical Society. Leadbeater, Besant, Blavatsky, those are the writers I recommend from the Theosophical writings and the compilers like A.E. Powell. And then Bailey, the book Esoteric Healing has a great deal of information. Alice Bailey, information about death. And Laurency has his own perspectives. I'll share some of those as well. It's a lot of information. We hear people say death is the great mystery. And nobody knows what happens, and no one can know. But that's not so true, unfortunately. Well, fortunately, there's tons of information. There's lots of opportunities for us to research on our own. And we've actually had the experience many, many times, life after life. So this great mystery, theosophy, Bailey, Alice A. Bailey, and Laurency are my sources of material. And I've also had interesting research experiment going. I talked to a local psychic who has made it, done quite a bit of work helping people contact their departed relatives. And I'll share information from her. It's ultimately the promise of esoterics and our spiritual path is that we will verify everything for ourselves. We'll develop the senses. It won't just be taking the word of some other person or reading it from a book. We'll open up our own abilities, and it's good to talk to the people who've already done some of that. Another question that I'm asked, a question I'm asked when I give these talks, especially about subjects where people don't believe they can know, is, how do you know? And a related question, how can I know? The questioner asks, how can they know for themselves? And the answer is actually the same for both. There are a few things required. First, you've got to really want to know. It's got to be important to you, important enough to put some effort into looking into it. And that effort involves the second phase, which is to look at what you think you know. And once you've cleared out, it can take a great deal of effort, but if you've cleared out the things you're sure you know about death or whatever esoteric topic already, then you can research and you can ask those who know. That's how I know. I actually have studied this because it was very important to me. I had to know. Skepticism is important, however, and in this field especially, in dealing with the people who were trying to help you talk to those who've departed, skepticism is important. And really watch out for the really mental approaches that teach this is all, if it's not confirmed by science, then forget about it. And it has to be this very definite thing that everybody agrees on. Science is not going to catch up on this for quite a while, on knowledge about death and consciousness going beyond human form. So you're going to have to go beyond that. So I'm just going to state the most basic facts of it first. There is not only life after death, there is another life here after death. This is Esoterics 101. Reincarnation's just a fact. It's not something that is in doubt to me at all. I've had my own experiences and memories of reconnected with the knowledge of past lives. It's simply the way it works. And also, sowing and reaping, karma, cause and effect. This is at work. And I've seen it played out over many great periods of time, over previous lifetimes. This is, any system of thought, any approach to explaining life that doesn't include these things is missing key elements and will not explain human life well enough to be satisfactory. And it'll lead you to that place where you have to know and you can't accept any more of what the religions or the sciences have offered. There has to be more information than we can find out there in the ordinary world. So speaking of things that you find out there in the world, there are some horrible things, like the doctrine of eternal hell is one of the cruelest of fictions. And it flies in the face of the loving purposes of life and of God, if you want to call all the divine consciousness God. The purpose is loving. It's to develop our consciousness. We're assisted by beings that are greater than us, not thrown into some trash can hell for eternity. It doesn't take a lot of thought to figure out what people are up to who are proposing eternal hell and eternal heaven. And the people that started that sort of thought long ago really ended up with a lot of control levers to push on people. Well, they could threaten them with hell, or they could promise them heaven. They could get people to do what they wanted. There really is no, in esoterics, the hell that they talk about is the worst aspects of human life, our life here. The people are living in hells that we can hardly imagine. People with horrible lives and addictions and tragedies. And I'll talk a little bit more about other human-created hells. There are more. We're very imaginative as humans. So reincarnation, the law of rebirth applies to everything. It's basically saying that consciousness inhabits forms, uses those forms to interface to a particular world. We need a physical body to contact the physical world. That seems obvious. We need an emotional body to contact the emotional world, a mental body for the mental. This is not as clear in external teachings, but in esoterics, that's how it works. We can take on new bodies, we have new experiences, we wear out the bodies, or we outgrow them. You know, as our consciousness evolves, the body doesn't serve a more expanded consciousness anymore that has spent its entire lifetime learning to play a musical instrument. Even that is a refinement in our bodies that requires a more, a body that can do that sort of thing, a more refined body. We come back again, ready to try it again with a better equipment. The plants, insects, animals, humans, all solar systems. There's a cycle of out breath into the world, into dense form, and in breath back into the inner source of consciousness, where consciousness resides as it considers what to do next. You know, coming back again takes some preparation, and the experience of having lived takes a lot of processing to chew on what's happened. So it's an out breath, it's an in breath, it repeats, and we have many thousands of lifetimes involved in that process. One of the great blessings of dying is the forgetting. If we were born in remembering all the horrible things that happened to us in previous lives, and they've happened to all of us, then we would be trapped by past experiences. The fresh start from forgetting is essential, and that's, answers the question that we're asked so many times: why, if I was reincarnation, why don't I remember? That's a blessing. And in fact, forgetting itself is a wonderful thing. It's a wonderful gift from nature, and we can practice more of it ourselves. If we could do better at forgetting things that happened to us 10 or 20 years ago, we could maybe fix up that relationship with somebody without having to die to clear the slate. Now, as much as we do forget a lot of things, some things do seem to carry over, I've noticed from the literature. People who were burned at the stake in the inquisitions of medieval Christianity, they come back with generally quite a bit of antagonism towards religion and Christianity, and you'll often find very aggressive atheists among that group. So death, considering my own death, thank goodness, really. I'd have to work forever if it wasn't for death. At least I can retire because of death. It's an interesting sort of blessing that there's an end to a lifetime. The Esoteric says again and again, there really is no death from the perspective of those who understand the teachings, who have given us these teachings from the realms beyond human knowledge, that there is no end to us. This point of consciousness that is our ultimate actual self is absolutely indestructible. And it will continue to take on new forms and new consciousness right through higher kingdoms of nature that we can't even imagine. Laurency puts it as a basic a priori trinity, three things that can't be dissected further or constructed out of other things or fully explained at our level of consciousness: matter, motion, and consciousness. And we ourselves are the smallest bit of conscious matter at the core of all the bodies that we take on, called the monad, according to Laurency. And monads are indestructible. And when you think about it, there are some consequences to this fact, and that is that our relationships are also everlasting, should we preserve them, because they're with other beings that are indestructible. Our true selves, our true consciousnesses will outlast everything we see, except for the other people, and even those forms will outlast this country, this world, this solar system. It's all form, and all form is temporary on some scale. Now, if you think of yourself, this idea of immortality, of going on and on, depends somewhat on what you think you are. If you've identified strongly with yourself as a physical body, well, that is definitely going to come to an end. To be truly immortal is to be fully identified with the part of ourself that carries on, which is called the soul in these teachings. And even the soul itself is a form in some ways, is a body of some form, but we really can't address that from our level of consciousness yet. It does last through all of our human incarnations, though. So we're here in these dense physical bodies where we're really challenged. This world is not amenable to our desires. It's a lot of work to get what we want here, and we learn a lot from that. It's the particular density of it is striking when you compare it to the other levels. Like in the emotional world, the mental world, the matter of those worlds conforms immediately to our thoughts and expectations. Our emotions are made out of that matter. Our thoughts, likewise. We're creative beings, constructing there all the time. It's not so easy in the physical world. So physical life, the goals of it are very important. It's very important, actually. We can't have the big breakthroughs in worlds where we can create any subjective reality we want. This resistance of this world and the dealing with people who have very different perspectives on things is how we learn. So our physical incarnations, as much as they are the densest level of consciousness that we have to work with, they are the most important for us. We come here to make progress. And in between lives in the states I'll talk more about later, we're mainly there to rest, to digest our experiences, to prepare for the next incarnation. You know, there's an interesting aspect to having bodies, and that is that often they get to the point where they don't serve the goals of consciousness any further. And Laurency says, normal death means that an envelope is discarded that has ceased to offer the self opportunities of new experience and further consciousness development. Nothing is more pitiful than witnessing the care taken to preserve a useless frame. Still, people are so ignorant of life that they believe that death is the end of it all, whereas it is the liberator from an existence unfit for life. You know, the keeping alive of people whose bodies are completely unable to serve their consciousness, unable for them to communicate with others with or reach any kind of goal or understanding, that shows a lack of trust in nature, basically. Nature is wisely terminating the forms all around us, except human forms we preserve artificially. It brings up the topic of euthanasia. There is a plan that the soul sets in motion for each incarnation. It's not set in stone, but we basically have some milestones along the way that are set up for us, that we've set up ourselves before we incarnate. And this soul and our guardian angel are working. Perhaps you can think of those one and the same. It's a different talk. And any of my other talks, you can go to onepurelove.com. I have a talk on the soul there with lots of details. This life and death is a decision kind of above our pay grade. Leaving it up to the soul is very important. The time will come, say the books, when we are enough soul conscious, we relate closely enough to the purposes and alignment with the soul consciousness that we can choose to some degree when we're going to go. And when we do that, this is predicted, we prearrange it with the ceremony and an agreed upon time. I don't think we're really there yet. It takes that kind of soul awareness. So another aspect, I'm just thinking of the questions that people ask about death. And will it hurt is obviously a question that's asked widely, and that is answered in the esoteric material. No, doesn't really hurt. What it says in the Bailey books is that there's a sense of impending peril and then something like an electric shock. And that will make more sense as I explain more of the actual mechanics as they're described in the esoteric books, the mechanics of separating from the physical form. And so just to do a high-level overview, we shed the physical body, we still inhabit the emotional body. This emotional world is a subtle world interpenetrating the physical. It's what we experience our emotions in. The material of the emotional world makes up this emotional body and our emotions. When we sleep at night, we release the physical and get out of its way so it can do some actual healing work that we interfere with all of our emotions. And in our emotional body, we dream. And death is a matter of just simply not coming back to a physical body because it's not there to come back to. This effort we've put into this body, we've got to start out as infants. It's a big process to get used to physical reality. It's very different than emotional world reality or mental or the level of the soul. From infancy, figuring out how to move and communicate and dodge dangers. And, we have particular hazards of physical life. All of that, it doesn't really apply in the emotional world. In the emotional world, we're held together electromagnetically, and we can't be harmed. We can be, there's still some possibilities of suffering, but we can talk about those in a moment. The emotional world, just to give you a few of the descriptions that we've heard, it's got another dimension. The physical plane has 3 dimensions, the emotional 4, and this 4th dimension apparently gives you a different sensory perception of things. You see all sides at once, or you can, unless you're somebody who's recently come from the physical world and is trying to force 3D perception and reality on everything. That's apparently people are quite disoriented when they try to apply their 3-dimensional understanding of life to the emotional world. You can travel to any point in that world in an instant. There is not day or night there. The sun and stars are not visible. It's kind of a cloudy world. It's misnamed the astral plane, since astral means starry and no stars are visible. This early naming problem came about because the word astral was applied to the etheric world, a subtler aspect of the physical where 3 times as many stars are visible. So we are basically safe there, and it's a good thing to know because every scary thing that humans imagine can be found there. It's a world of illusory, imagined, except for where the astral correspondences to the physical are there. Everything else in the higher levels, there are different levels of this emotional world, is fantasy. And that's one reason we can't learn much there. You can find fantastic constructions of Middle Earth there that people have added to, that Tolkien himself created. You can find the heavens imagined over the ages by all the religions. You can find the hells. They're just as scary as one might hope, but they're not mandatory. And as Laurency points out, that in the emotional world, unlike the physical, we can simply refuse to suffer. It's our body there. We can say, no, I'm not buying this, and just not suffer at all. Physical body, that's not possible without a great deal of effort, and that effort is so significant that you basically can't really disregard pain without a big impact. So what we find there, it's not the esoteric realities, and it's not the masters either. Those who've gone beyond human have their representations there created by devotees. Christ, Buddha, everybody's got their fantasy version in the emotional world that act exactly the way that people think they ought to act or expect them to act. People worship these fantasy forms. And obviously our beliefs affect our experience there quite a bit. If we can conform the matter of that world to our imaginings, then our beliefs will have a big impact. My grandfather told the story of his father. When his father died, He was a person, his belief system was that there was no life after physical life, that it was over. When you died, that's it, no more, you don't exist. So he went into the emotional world with that belief. And when my grandfather checked on him sometime later, he found him huddled in a kind of self-imposed darkness, trying not to exist. So it helps to have beliefs a little more aligned with reality when you go there. I think Norman was able to help him. There's activity in these worlds, in the emotional world. We tend to be grouped with the people who speak the same language. We still communicate with language. And there are great debates and discussions, and there are schools you can go to. There are those who in their earthly life serve, teach, and they carry on the momentum and try to serve and teach whoever they can find on the other side. And thank goodness there are those that want to serve there, because those who've just crossed over need a lot of help. My grandfather told me a story of something that he saw there, of great groups of people that would, in the lower realms of the emotional world, running at each other and tearing each other to bits like they were made of bark or something, tearing chunks out of each other. And after everybody had torn each other to bits, they would all reassemble and pull back and then run at each other again until they'd worked off every angry impulse they'd acquired in human existence by tearing these versions of each other to bits in that world. So I mentioned the emotional world has got its different vibrational levels. It's got the lowest levels where the worst kind of emotionality is present. It's pretty much a domain of hatred, not a place where people hang out unless that's their fundamental frequency. If they vibrate to levels of hatred, they're going to spend some time there until they wear that off. It's an interesting thing happens that I will get into in a moment about how we make it through these different subplanes of the emotional world. The highest subplanes of the emotional world are the heaven worlds, and they're sparsely populated because few people are actually operating with the really beautiful emotional bodies that they develop in this life, bodies that are about admiration, affection, aesthetic appreciation, the beautiful emotional nature. Also in the lowest subplanes can be found the animals. They don't have any particular reason to go higher. They like to stay close to the earth planes because in the lowest levels, the physical constructs of the physical world, the emotional forms that correspond to the physical individuals and structures can be found there. So, I realize that for those who are unfamiliar with esoterics, the things I've been talking about are quite a stretch. But if there's one thing you can conclude from this, that there's a lot more that you could know if you looked into it. And it's going to get even stranger. So let me start on that part. The actual mechanics of death, the physical form, this dense physical body that we're aware of, has what's called an energy body that interpenetrates it, the etheric body. It animates the dense form. Without the etheric body, the dense form could do nothing, would just lie flat. It takes the energy from the etheric body that is stepped down into physical motion. It perfectly interpenetrates the physical, and actual ending of a physical incarnation is when that etheric body is separated from the dense physical. When that happens, that's actually the end of physical incarnation. There's no cosmic being, according to Laurency, who can put that back together again. But as long as the etheric body hasn't yet separated from the dense physical, it's still possible for that person to potentially be revived, as unlikely as it might be. This etheric body connects to the physical at the chakras, or glandular centers is how they're represented in the physical body. And it's not a simple process. It can be a troublesome process, actually, for this etheric body to separate from the physical. It's very much attached. The soul assists as is needed, and the attraction of the soul becomes stronger than the attraction of the physical body, and that pulls apart those two forms. Once the etheric body has left the physical, then the physical begins to decompose. That's the surest sign that the person will not be coming back. Then it's this etheric body. It's an etheric world around us as well. This interpenetrates the physical, a less dense body. It's actually the higher level subplanes of the physical world. It is visible to many people, especially people who have devoted their lives to healing often can see this energy body. And healing has a lot to do with working with that body. It's much more important to work with that than the dense physical body. If you're working with the etheric, you can, and somebody who can actually see that can look at someone and say, well, the body's deficient in this energy here, it's congested with the energy here, and help straighten that out. Working with colored energy works with the etheric body as well. This new awareness of the etheric body is increasing rapidly. It's expected to be unfolding for all of humanity in relatively short order as these things go. It's the next human sense to open up. Now, I know that from talking to my grandmother who had etheric objective awareness, that's what's called, clairvoyance is another word for it. She didn't like to go anywhere near cemeteries because apparently the etheric body, once it's separated from the physical, actually decomposes at the same tempo as the physical and hovers above it. And it was all too visible to her to see decomposing etheric bodies. And that points out something that Theosophy has tried to correct since its very beginnings. The burial of bodies is tremendously unhygienic. And Laurency warns about this, that we don't, medical science does not yet understand all the potential disease germs, points of infection that are carried over in a body. And when a body decomposes into the soil, it ends up in the water. Some of these bits are absorbed by plants and they end up back in people again. It perpetuates disease. The Theosophical Society was actually behind the construction of the first crematorium in the United States in 1876 in Pennsylvania. Something to be proud of. About 50% of people opt for cremation these days, but it was very controversial back then. But beyond the importance of the hygiene aspect, it also destroys not only the physical body, but the etheric body. Bring it to the fire like that. And that frees up the departing individual to move on to their emotional life without still being attracted to a decomposing form. Not that they do stay with us, but it makes it easier to release and move on. So once the etheric body has separated from the physical, then the emotional body has to separate from the etheric body, another separation process that goes on. And the emotional body then finds itself basically a naked emotional being in the emotional world. This is frightening for a lot of emotional bodies. And apparently, getting into the mechanics of this, when they no longer have the physical body to shape themselves on as a template, they revert to kind of an egg shape and push all of their densest material to the outside in a defensive kind of maneuver. And the problem with being a body with this your densest emotional matter on the outside is that's what you are going to relate to of the emotional subplanes. Your experience of the emotional world is based on what's on the outside. So people start out in the very lowest levels until they've worn off all whatever of the lower emotional nature they've had in themselves. Many people have none of this lowest, but if they do have some, it's on the outside, it's worn off. And then the individual thinks, oh, well, this is a much nicer world now. Now they're relating to a higher vibrational part of the emotional world. And they think it's better, but it's not the world that they've traveled from one world to another. They've simply improved their vehicles to get there. Now, that's not necessarily, this stratification of the emotional body is not necessarily required. Apparently, if a person has got enough mental activity, they can keep the emotional body stirred up, and or potentially a group of individuals or helpers on the other side. I'm not quite sure, but there are various ways that an individual can help keep the emotional body stirred up and be relating to all the aspects of the emotional world at once, rather than just starting at the lowest. So another thing that happens on entering the emotional world is a reunion. Our guardian angel, covered in my talk on the soul, arranges a reunion for us with all those who have loved us and are in the emotional world who can be met there. And that, I imagine, has a lot to do with being helped through the initial phases of life in the emotional world, is that you've got people who love you there with experience. They can help you maybe keep your emotional body stirred up, maybe help you understand these new dimensions. It's something to look forward to. And after some time, after perhaps 20, 50 years in the emotional world, and time seems to be different there. It might seem to go, what seems to be a short time there might be a long time in the physical world. After that period, the individual then has a second shedding of bodies. They shed the emotional body. It's, the substance of the emotional body has interacted and completed various fantasies, whatever it is that people have needed to do in the emotional world. They shed the emotional body, they find themselves strictly a mental body. Now, in the emotional world, it's possible to have objective consciousness. I think you need some help to get there, but to perceive the creatures and, creations in the emotional world, rather than just living in a subjective world like our dreams at night. Though there's some, I'm not quite sure about that. At night, maybe we are having some objective awareness of the emotional world. But to get to the mental world, only the most advanced humans on the verge of being beyond human have objective awareness there. We move into completely subjective life there. But what we're working on in the mental world is everything we've really thought about, the ideas that have inspired us, the things we've really given some consideration in this world. We get to in a state of bliss, actually, and the mental world is the heaven world for humans. We get to just think these things through. It depends on how much you've thought in this world. They say that Plato had built up 10,000 years worth of material to think about as he moved on to the mental plane. Don't know if he spent all that time there. So once we're in the mental state, it's a pretty darn happy place. It's also completely subjective, and it suits our creations and our processing of ideas. We think of the mental world sometimes as kind of dry, like mental individuals can be, and it's really the lower planes of the mental world are, the planes of the kind of thought that does accounting, that organizes things, inference thinking, that's just basic thought. But the higher planes are actually, they say that it's on the higher levels of the mental is where we can experience true love, that love is very much a real concept in the higher levels of the mental. So it's very subjective. We might spend a long time there, depending on how much stuff we have to work off, and eventually the mental body is shed. And that concludes the incarnation. When the physical, emotional, and mental bodies are released, then we've moved back to the soul level, what's called the causal body, which is actually in the higher subplanes of the mental world, built of that very high grade material. And the virtues, the realizations, the newly acquired essences of our incarnation are distilled into the soul. At the end of each incarnation, what we've gained is distilled into something that's preserved in the causal body. It's a reservoir of all the unique understandings and abilities that we've built up over many thousands of incarnations. All of our past selves, and eventually it is on our path to wake up in that body, to know ourselves to be all of the people we've been. And I suspect that a lot of that involves the capacity to handle that. I would think having a great compassion for everybody, good, bad, or indifferent, is involved in accepting all of our past selves as well. But once we can do that, we can wake up as the soul, essentially, and we are very close to free from the need to ever actually incarnate again. That is also on the path for us to eventually be free from the need. And this is called being a causal self. And that's the very last phase of human life before we move on and don't need to be human at all anymore. But that means having unbroken continuity of consciousness. Once the causal self has mastered its new body, there's no more need for the unconsciousness of sleep at night, the unconsciousness of dying and forgetting. There's no more of that. It's unbroken consciousness. So that gets us to really the ultimate goal of the human kingdom, waking up as this one, as the being that has been all of us, all of our lives. And to that being, the past is as real as the present, is clearly visible. That's maybe why it's called the causal self, because all causes are visible. When the past is visible, what's going on now can be seen as a chain of cause and effect that led to why we're here, what's going on. And some of the future is visible because of probabilities. There's so many threads in motion that some of the future can be seen as well from the causal level. A causal self may have some karma still, some obligations. They incarnate again to work through the final aspects of being human. So we don't really remember this, of course, when we come back, but it's in the causal world when we are working with other consciousnesses that may be part of our soul group, that could be our sponsors from higher levels. There are all kinds of beings on these higher levels that we interact with. They may work with us, and the agents of karma can work with us to plan another incarnation. Each incarnation, as I said, has a plan, and there are goals, and the goals all have to do with the evolution of consciousness, and the evolution of consciousness is in the direction towards understanding the unity of all. So this information, most of what I've just been talking about, is information I've read, and I don't have direct experience of much besides knowing I've lived before. Then there are people who have more direct information. So I interviewed a psychic here in Salt Lake City, and it was fascinating. I learned a few things and tried to confirm some of the things I've been reading in the books, and some I could confirm and some not so much. So she was just as interested as I was, as I suppose a lot of the people are that talk to her, in getting information that could be verified, so that she knew she was really talking to who she thought she was. People come to her and they want to know, they want to contact their departed loved ones, and those loved ones generally want to let people know they're okay here in this world, and that's the basic communication. For example, my wife went to talk to her and asked her about her mom, and the psychic said to my wife, "What do lemon bars mean to you?" And it turns out that my father-in-law was still alive, and every week Valerie was bringing lemon bars to him. And this is something that her mom thought was a very sweet gesture, and she wanted to comment on it, and commented through the psychic. So that sort of thing is very nice for getting a confirmation. There are many examples of that. We had a psychic friend in Port Townsend who came to our house. We were doing a clearing. She had more awareness than us and could look and make sure there weren't other beings around that we didn't necessarily want there, and he needed help moving on. And she looked around the house and she said, "There's a collie dog here." And we found out later that the folks across the street had a collie dog that had died a month before. I thought that was a fascinating kind of confirmation. She refers to those who've gone beyond as spirits, and she says that she can open their book of life, she calls it. Though some pages may be blocked, she's not allowed necessarily to see everything, but she can look and see some aspects of their future, can talk to them about it. I actually had a similar experience when I turned 40, I think it was. In a meditation, I saw a ruler laid out in front of me. And I realized it was marked off in tens, and it meant the years of my life. And it was quite a fascinating thing. And I zoomed in to see, all right, where are we going? And then at one point, and I haven't mentioned ever to anyone what age this was, because I didn't want to lend any energy to it. And I also do believe these things can be changed by our actions. But at a particular age, over the course of a couple of years, the ruler went from red to gold. There was like a turbulence as the as the red turned into gold. I thought, well, when I get to that age, I'm really gonna have to see what's going on. That could mean transitioning right out of the body for all I know. But that's maybe a ruler of life. I suppose maybe I'd encountered that. This book of life is interesting. She said that she can contact people who have crossed over. And that meant people who've accepted their new life. And she is not so easily able to contact those who are earthbound, that through the use of their free will and their egos are still attached to the earth in some way, attached to life here. And she couldn't contact them unless they were in the same room or her guides helped her contact them. I thought that was fascinating. I suspect that part of her ability to contact the beings in the higher levels was due to her own intentions. She was very selflessly trying to help people. For her, it was service work. And these people that she said had carried over, when she talked to them about their understanding of things, they were aware that that had just been one of many lives. So I've got to assume that people that didn't have any idea about that in this world are informed of it in the other world somehow. She told the story of a Mormon woman who was very devoted to her scripture, and she thought that when she contacted her, she might have the woman telling her, well, sure wasn't what I expected. It was all very different. But the woman was actually very, very happy with the new knowledge, to know that she'd lived before and would live again, but was also very content with the life she'd lived, that she brought her great joy to focus on the scripture, and she liked the community of the church, and it had been a good life for her. She told a fascinating story about going with other psychic investigators to a theater, the Empress Theater in Magna, Utah, where there are musicals and plays, and it's rumored to be haunted. People said that. And they set up something to trigger some motion to get yes and no answers, and they were getting some yes and no answers and recording the whole session, the audio of the session. And this was fascinating to me. They went back and listened to the audio afterward, and they could hear a woman's voice talking all about her life in the next world, and about being shot by somebody outside the theater, probably over 100 years ago. And she had been a burlesque dancer, and she loved entertainment, and she stayed at the theater. She didn't move on to the higher levels of the emotional world because she loved being part of the plays, there'd just been a production of South Pacific there, and she sang a little bit of, I'm going to wash that man right out of my hair. So that's pretty unusual, pretty fascinating. And this psychic that I spoke to said there are a lot of people out there trying to make a buck on it. They're not coming from the highest energy on it. And I think that coming from a place of service actually is protective. She wasn't, dealing with difficult entities because she was protected by her intentions. She was focusing on the higher levels where those beings also had good intentions. But this theater had some pretty awful entities too. They asked the burlesque dancer about it, and she said, oh, well, don't worry about them. They can't hurt you. She didn't mind them. I don't know if any of you have watched the series on Netflix called Surviving Death. And there is some fascinating stuff there. And she was pretty critical of a lot of the people there that, would be chained up and put in a closet and channeling from in there. And in general, mediumship has been, attracted many frauds over the years. She didn't really care for that. But on one episode that I thought was particularly excellent, episode 6 on reincarnation, where they talked to children, multiple cases where children would describe a previous life with details that were shockingly accurate. A previous name, the name of the ship they were on when it was sunk in World War II, their crew members, they could say far more than you would think. And this show it's interesting to run into these shows on Netflix or YouTube. All of them seem to have this creepy music. I can't stand the soundtrack they put on these movies or these shows. They hire somebody that does scores for horror movies. It really just kind of sabotages the whole thing and makes you suspect it all. And really, I do suspect the people that create these things for Netflix, I think they're not doing it to enlighten anybody. They're doing it to make money. And it's just really designed as a product, But still, many of the people in there actually did have some abilities, and they had some absolutely unexplainable things, and it was fascinating. Back in the days of Spiritism, mediumship was more of a bad kind of mediumship, where mediums would give up their bodies, like just step aside from their bodies and let them be used by a discarnate entity. And that was a complete crapshoot. It's whoever came in that had something to say. And they're the people that are frauds and attention seekers in this lifetime, they're no different on the other side. They have the same motivations, and they are happy to mislead or otherwise misuse a situation like that. It's very dangerous to the health of the medium to give over their body for use like that. The psychic doesn't do that. Blavatsky actually got involved in the spiritist movement back in 1875 when it became her role to start trying to reintroduce this esoteric knowledge to humanity. And that was considered maybe a way to approach people on it, because there was some evidence of other worlds that people were shaking up the hard-headed thinkers of the late 1800s. And Blavatsky was a causal self. She actually could make phenomena happen. She knew exactly what was going on in all the circumstances. She had abilities that others didn't have. And one time she actually went to one of the seances, saw that they were faking all the phenomena, or preparing to, and decided to have some fun. And she caused the phenomena to happen, actually. And the people who were faking it were, as you might expect, terrified. So, but seances and that sort of thing, well, there's something there. There are intelligences that don't have physical bodies. That much we can say. There's enough evidence of it. The psychic, like her, works with guides, and she considers that also part of the protection. And her guides actually could contact the earthbound spirits if somebody really wanted to talk to them. And sometimes the spirits themselves had no desire to make contact. She tried to respect that as well. I asked her about animals, and as I mentioned, they stay around the house. They really like to stay near their people. There's what I've read about in the books is that there's kind of a barrier between these worlds for a reason, that those who've left the physical body behind, they're trying to carry on their lives in the emotional world. But it's so different. They have a lot to learn. And the big part of the job for them is to let go of physical existence and physical life. And if they have people here in this world that are just pulling on them, desperately clinging to them, it can make it much harder for them. They do sense our emotions, our thoughts. There's an old Greek phrase that translates to speak only good of the dead. And we hear it translated as speak no ill of the dead sometimes. And really it does help them to think positive things about them. It strengthens the stronger part of themselves that brings them into the higher levels of the emotional world. And releasing them is good too. Letting them move on. An interesting thing I asked her about was suicides. And in the esoteric books, there are dire statements about suicide, saying that Laurency says that nobody has to suffer in the emotional world except for suicides that suffer irremediably in the same state of mind they were in when they committed suicide. And that's a horrifying thought. And they stay in that state until their natural lifespan expires, the time they would have left the physical world. And other places it says that self-hatred or hatred of life carried over into the other side can act like a corrosive in the emotional world. Well, I did talk to her about this, and she did not confirm this. When she contacted suicides, they usually had accepted that that was just one of many lives, and that they'd moved on. Whether they had a regret or not, they weren't tortured with guilt. And perhaps, considering how many lifetimes we have and all the things we have to try to make it through the human kingdom, all of us have a lifetime as a suicide out of those many thousands of incarnations, maybe an experience that we would naturally have. And it kind of made me rethink it. It just sounds so horrible, the suffering that the books talk about. And the psychic said it can be part of a life plan even, which seems strange. But then my wife actually told a story that seemed to confirm that she, for many, many years in her career, she worked with institutionalized young people, boys, maybe 13, 14 years old, who were going through very difficult psychiatric problems. And a lot of them were suicidal. And they worked with the kids. They really tried to help them. And they probably prevented a lot of suicides. But one boy, after he'd gone back home after treatment for several months, after a few months, he took his own life. And the parents, instead of, sometimes you find that they'll blame the institution that was trying to help the child. Instead, they donated hundreds of thousands of dollars to expand a wing of the institution to try to help other kids not have to go through that. And I can kind of see that as a confirmation of it being part of a life plan, that suicide actually ended up opening his parents' hearts and helping other kids. There's another story of in the esoteric books about someone who committed suicide because they were being tortured and knew that they couldn't hold out any longer, and they would be giving up the names of their friends and putting them in great danger. They knew they couldn't it was too much for them. So they committed suicide, and then they were welcomed and praised on the other side. So I suppose there's no one general rule here. I mean, for myself, I only remember one death definitely from a previous lifetime, and one that I think was possibly from suicide. And I remember in that lifetime floating up away from the body and thinking, that poor girl. And I was already distancing myself from it. I wasn't in that state. So if that's what it was, that's a personal experience. Another lifetime, the one I remember most clearly dying in, I offered my soul up to Zeus with great passion. Alice Bailey reported attempting suicide 3 times as a child before she was 15. This is a very advanced soul. She thought life was meaningless. So when you read that about her, I guess it encourages some compassion. I like thinking of the suicides as just basically getting the scoop on the other side. I mean, if we can help inform people now, tell people about the knowledge of the law of rebirth, maybe, the thing is, you can't dodge anything, run away from anything. Eventually, you're going to have to come back and deal with whatever it was you thought you might be escaping. So might as well tackle it this time, That knowledge ought to help. An interesting thing in the books that the psychic also did not confirm, but I thought it was just a fascinating kind of tidbit to report, that Laurency reports that nicotine paralyzes the emotional body. It's a paralytic for the emotional body, and not just physical. And that may be why people like it, it calms emotions. But that someone who dies addicted to nicotine, they find themselves in an emotional body. They can't move, and it takes them some time in the emotional world to regain the ability to animate that body. She did not confirm that. I thought it was interesting that. So let's talk about life and death. A wise old woman, neighbor here told my wife something I thought was very profound. She said, life is long. You hear people say, life is short and you only live once. Wrong and wrong. Life is long. We have the opportunity, and not to mention further lives. In one lifetime, we have the opportunity to have multiple lives, especially compared to hundreds of years ago when we lived a short life of one sort and died. This lifetime, we would have multiple families and careers. And, eventually I'm going to retire. And that's like a new life for me. I'll be starting a new life of working with this material and trying to write about it and teach it more. There are many possibilities of adventure and love and awakening in our bodies, to whatever limits they have. We can still do a lot of those things. It's said that some of the greatest suffering in the emotional world is regret for missed opportunities to love. And if there was ever a clue for how to get more out of life, that would be it. What we start in love, as I mentioned, is everlasting relationships between people. What we start in love between two of our immortal selves, we get the opportunity to continue with in some incarnation. And as tragic as it may be to be parted from someone we love, we will be reunited. When someone dies, we're advised to celebrate that they're freed. Of course, as I talked about at the very beginning, we have to acknowledge the difficulty. The difficulty for us, really not so much for them. Like Long John Silver said in Treasure Island, he said, them that dies is the lucky ones. Well, those that have moved on really are really not doing badly at all. And it's us that has to work on handling that. Death is to be respected for sure. And in some of the worst epics of human history is when people stop respecting it. Then you get a Hitler or a Pol Pot that slaughter indiscriminately. Our modern entertainment has far too little respect for death. You've got some character on the screen for a minute and he's killed, and it's just it doesn't show any respect for the fact that every life is its own story, has its own poignancy. And in my opinion, speaking of death and capital punishment, for instance, I don't think that we have the right to kill anyone, any defenseless person who is no threat. Self-defense, yeah, that is a real thing, but killing a person who is no threat to us, in fact, I can tell you from my own experience, I mentioned learning things about karma from previous lives. Don't support the idea of capital punishment unless you want to share responsibility for giving that person a life. I can tell you from experience. So an improved understanding is what is mentioned many times in these books. That, I read in Bailey and Laurency that there's been a goal on the part of the guides of humanity to help us not be so afraid and overcome the misapprehensions. And they even mention that there will be established methods of photography that will not only show the etheric body separating from the physical, but the emotional body separating from the etheric. This is coming in the time frame it was predicted. It could be within our lifetimes, and it could already be happening if you believe things you see on YouTube. And then, as I mentioned with that burlesque dancer, that in the Bailey books, it says a kind of radio contact would be established. And, our new electronic recording mediums, our means of recording sound and light have been changing continually. They mentioned that some aspect of recording with electrical phenomenon will help record these events in the future. Well, of course, now that we're in a world of people doubt everything they hear and see, this may maybe take longer for us to accept that this photography or radio have come about when it finally does. And one of the reasons they're encouraging us to try to overcome this fear and teach about it if we know something about it is that fear is always used to manipulate humanity. People who are afraid are more easily controlled and have this very unfortunate tendency of flocking to the one who has told them they should be afraid, to the leader that is manipulating them through their fear. If humanity can just wake up and move to higher emotional levels too, because all this fear is happening at the lower emotional levels. If we can refine our emotionality, we will immunize ourselves against some very awful people who could try to control us through our fear. There's far too much of that in the world. So another fact of all this, to reiterate again, is that the point is rest. It's not punishment. It's to get over what is a difficult existence for everybody. Nobody has it easy. It's a challenge to be here. So we're developing our capacity to eventually be done with death, but we've got a ways to go. So it's better to try to be comfortable with it. Let me also try to correct something that I've seen in some teachings. This idea that, it says basically the material of our bodies, physical, emotional, mental, it is rejoins the pools of that material, dissolves away, and it's the ashes to ashes, dust to dust idea. That's important. We've borrowed this material to have a form. We release it, it goes back. And we ourselves do not dissolve. This idea that we dissolve into nirvana consciousness and are no more because we're one with everything. No. We do not lose this individuality that we've worked so hard to create. All the way through the human kingdom, we're building a personality, learning more about who we are, and that effort is not in vain. The great beings that have gone beyond human are still very much individuals. That's certainly the goal, to, as an individual, participate in the collective consciousness, ever larger collective consciousnesses. But to think that we suddenly, boom, we're in the universal collective consciousness, and that's actually a goal in a way to share in the universal consciousness that we will not reach for a long time. We work through larger and larger collectives to get there. So we're not annihilated. That's definitely not true. So if I'm going to talk about life and death, I've got to talk a little bit about COVID. Here we are in the middle of an epidemic, and there are a few things said about epidemics in the esoteric teachings. And then an interesting story, a friend of my wife's has some psychic ability, always has. At the beginning of the pandemic, she had an experience of the heavens opening up and all these angels and spirits coming to earth. And she eventually interpreted that to mean that all these beings were aware of what was about to happen and were going to assist with all the newly deceased people that were going to need help on the other side. Which, according to esoterics, wars, pandemics, these are not part of our individual karma. These are part of a much larger scale of plan that's maybe the karma of humankind, of the whole species. And for those sorts of things, there are arrangements made so that the people on the other side get extra help. So here's something Laurency says about pandemics. If the atoms in the microorganisms flying about in the air are activated by human repulsive vibrations of hate, they can find expression in the manner called epidemics, and that in a great number of varieties. New kinds of disease will always arise as long as the consciousness expressions of mankind are repulsive. Lawrence doesn't mince words about where humanity is at. We have a long way to go. And expressions of hatred are, pretty low grade aspects of life that show that we're still at a low level emotionally. Another interesting thing he says is that viruses have no life of their own. Obviously, we know that from science. They require our own cells' machinery to reproduce, which means they're parasites. And what Laurency says is that diseases, epidemics, vermin, and insect pests are parasitic phenomena. As long as human beings parasitize on others, and they do so to an extent they apparently do not suspect, they will be victims of parasitism themselves. So, once again, if we cleaned up our act, we'd be a lot safer. We wouldn't be producing epidemics and natural disasters, etc. So, as I mentioned before, that they say the greatest regret that people have is regrets or missed opportunities to love. That's certainly worth remembering. And I'm sure that some regret the mess they've left behind. There's been a recent kind of a trend of death cleaning, it's called, that somebody started a while back. And I think that's a good one. You know, don't leave behind a bunch of junk. Looking at what different individuals have said, the Dalai Lama, when he turned 50, somebody asked him, okay, what are you going to do now? And he said, well, so I'm going to start preparing to die. Well, he's been preparing for over 30 years now, so hopefully he's well prepared. April 10th of last year, a teacher that many of us have had, Jim Riddell, who's also spoken at Quest Bookshop years ago, he left his body. And it was interesting to talk with him and participate with him in this process to the degree that he wanted us to ask questions. You know, he wanted us to learn about what he was going through in this whole process and try to get some new information out of it. And he really was brave in the face of it all. And I think he had a pretty smooth transition. His body had certainly ceased to serve him very well. It was in very bad shape. But and he actually is the founder of the esotericlaw.com website that I'm part of a group of his former students that maintain that site. And we try to keep all of his good ideas going there. He did a great job, I think, of introducing esoterics to people of a more mental, possibly skeptical type. The day before he died, Ted in our group had a dream that Jim told him that he would be leaving at 11 a.m. the next day. And then he did leave the next day, very close to that. I think it was 10:45 or something like that. A fascinating little anecdote about death and a teacher of ours. I've heard various teachers say a death in this world is a birth in the next. And a birth in this one is like death in the other. And Laurency said that when to one's friends in the higher worlds, when it's time to incarnate again, it's as if you've died. They mourn as well. You're not with them anymore. You've come down to be in this world again, this dense physical world again. A local shaman asked about death, says there's no such thing as death. It is a door. I don't know how you can put it any simpler than that. And we're old pros at dying, actually. When you consider how many thousands of incarnations we've had, don't we deep down know that it's about rest? We've been putting RIP, rest in peace, on tombstones for so long. It's only the worst side of human imagination that can make us fear what is natural, what is a release, a gift offered by nature, really, of freedom. You know, it's for our benefit. It's part of nature of every living form. There's great comfort, really, in trusting life. And if we're going to trust life, we need to trust death.